Karen was, to put it mildly, particular. She lived in the Harmony Glades Homeowners Association, and she treated the HOA rulebook like it was the most important book ever written. Some people collected stamps, Karen collected violations. She knew every single rule, from the acceptable shade of beige for exterior paint, antique ivory, section 3, 2b, to the precise height allowed for rose bushes, no more than 36 inches, section 7, 1a. The other residents of Harmony Glades mostly tried to avoid her. They knew that even the smallest infraction, a slightly overgrown lawn, a misplaced garbage can, would result in a sternly worded letter, often hand-delivered with a pursed lip lecture. Some whispered that she enjoyed wielding her self-appointed power a little too much. Her own house was, of course, impeccably maintained, a shining example of HOA compliance. It was almost sterile, lacking the warmth and personality that characterized the other homes in the neighborhood. Karen wasn't just dedicated, she was driven. She saw it as her civic duty to uphold the standards of Harmony Glades. She truly believed that without her vigilance, the community would descend into chaos, overrun by unruly flowerbeds and incorrectly colored mailboxes. She patrolled the streets like a neighborhood watch captain, clipboard in hand, ready to pounce on any deviation from the established regulations. She genuinely thought she was doing everyone a favor, even if they didn't appreciate it. Most people rolled their eyes and quietly corrected their offenses. Arguing with Karen was like arguing with a brick wall. It was simply easier to comply. She had been on the HOA board for 5 years, and during that time, the number of official violations had tripled. Some secretly suspected she was making up rules just to have something to complain about. But deep down, Karen was lonely. She didn't have many friends. Her obsession with the HOA filled a void in her life. It gave her a sense of purpose, a feeling of control. She thought that by maintaining order in her surroundings, she could somehow maintain order in her own life. What she didn't realize was that her relentless pursuit of perfection was pushing people away and creating more disharmony than harmony. She had become a caricature, a walking, talking HOA rulebook, and the neighborhood was starting to resent her for it. They yearned for someone, anyone, to stand up to her. Someone who could finally put an end to her reign of beige terror. Into this perfectly manicured, slightly suffocating world stepped David Miller. David was the opposite of Karen in almost every way. He was easygoing, friendly, and possessed a contagious laugh that could brighten even the cloudiest day. He'd recently moved to Harmony Glades for a fresh start, seeking a quiet place to focus on his work. He was a lawyer, though he rarely mentioned it, preferring to talk about his hobbies, hiking, photography, and trying out new recipes. He bought a cozy, slightly run-down house at the end of the street, charmed by its potential. The previous owner hadn't been much of a gardener, so the yard was a bit overgrown, a wild tangle of weeds and wildflowers. David saw it as a blank canvas, a chance to create a little oasis of beauty. He envisioned a vibrant garden filled with colorful blooms, a place where he could relax and unwind after a long day. He started working on the yard immediately, pulling weeds, trimming bushes, and planting seeds. He wasn't an expert gardener, but he enjoyed the process of nurturing life and creating something beautiful. He chose a mix of native plants and colorful annuals, creating a cheerful and inviting space. He even painted his mailbox a bright, sunny yellow, thinking it would add a touch of personality to the neighborhood. Unbeknownst to David, his arrival had sent a ripple of unease through Harmony Glades, and especially through Karen. His slightly unkempt yard and cheerful mailbox were a direct affront to her carefully curated sense of order. She watched him from her window, her lips pursed in disapproval. She could already see several violations stacking up. The flower height was definitely exceeding the allowed limit, and that mailbox, well, it was simply outrageous. Yellow was not an approved color. The other residents, however, were cautiously optimistic. They saw David as a breath of fresh air, a welcome change from Karen's rigid rules. They watched him work in his yard, smiling and waving as they passed by. Some even stopped to chat, offering gardening tips and welcoming him to the neighborhood. They hoped that David would be the one to finally challenge Karen's authority, to bring a little bit of joy and spontaneity back to Harmony Glades. They had no idea just how right they were. The first official notice arrived 3 days after David painted his mailbox. It was a crisp, white envelope with the Harmony Glades HOA logo emblazoned on the corner. David, still blissfully unaware of the storm brewing, opened it with a smile, expecting a welcome packet or some neighborhood information. Instead, he found a sternly worded letter outlining 3 separate violations. Violation number 1, unauthorized mailbox color, Section 6. For C states mailboxes must be painted in one of the 3 approved neutral tones, beige, gray, or off-white. Violation number 2, flower height exceeding maximum allowance, Section 7. 1A limits rose bushes to 36 inches, several of Mr. Miller's roses are estimated to be closer to 40 inches. Violation number 3, unapproved ground cover, Section 8, 2B prohibits the use of wildflowers as ground cover, all ground cover must be pre-approved by the HOA Architectural Committee. David blinked, rereading the letter in disbelief. He chuckled, thinking it must be some kind of joke. He couldn't imagine anyone getting so worked up about a mailbox color or a few extra inches of rose bush. He decided to ignore it, figuring it was just a bureaucratic formality. The next day, Karen appeared on his doorstep, rulebook in hand. She wore a severe expression and her hair was pulled back in a tight bun. "Mr. Miller," she said, her voice sharp and disapproving, "I'm here to discuss the violations outlined in the letter you received." David, caught off guard, invited her in. He offered her a glass of iced tea, but she declined with a sniff. "I prefer to keep this formal," she said, opening her rulebook to the relevant sections. She proceeded to lecture him on the importance of following the HOA guidelines, emphasizing the need for uniformity and the preservation of property values. David listened patiently, trying to understand her perspective. He explained that he was new to the neighborhood and hadn't been aware of all the rules. He apologized for the violations and promised to address them as soon as possible. He thought that would be the end of it. He was wrong. The next day, Karen was back, this time with a measuring tape. She meticulously measured the height of his rose bushes, documenting each infraction with a photograph. She then proceeded to inspect his ground cover, pulling up a few stray wildflowers and shaking her head in dismay. "This is simply unacceptable, Mr. Miller," she said, her voice dripping with disapproval. "You must remove these wildflowers immediately and replace them with approved ground cover." David started to realize this wasn't a simple misunderstanding. This was war. The harassment escalated quickly. It wasn't just the yard anymore. Karen started scrutinizing every aspect of David's property. She complained about the type of welcome mat he had, Section 9. 5A clearly states that welcome mats must be made of natural fibers, not synthetic materials, the way he parked his car, Section 4. 2B prohibits parking on the grass, even for a moment, and even the music he played while gardening, Section 10. 1C restricts noise levels after 8 p.m., and Mr. Miller's polka music was clearly audible. Each morning, David would find a new violation notice taped to his door, each more ridiculous than the last. Karen seemed to have an endless supply of rules to enforce, and she took great pleasure in pointing out David's every transgression. She would often stand across the street, binoculars in hand, monitoring his activities and taking notes. David tried reasoning with her, explaining that he was just trying to make his house a home. He even offered to compromise, suggesting that he could trim the rose bushes and replace the mailbox, but keep a small patch of wildflowers as a personal touch. But Karen was unyielding. She insisted on strict adherence to the rules, showing no compassion or understanding. "The rules are the rules, Mr. Miller," she would say, her voice cold and inflexible. "They are in place for a reason. If everyone were allowed to do whatever they pleased, Harmony Glades would descend into chaos." The constant harassment was taking a toll on David. He found himself dreading each morning, wondering what new violation Karen would discover. He stopped enjoying his yard work, feeling like he was constantly being watched and judged. The joy he had initially felt about moving to Harmony Glades was quickly fading, replaced by frustration and resentment. He started documenting Karen's behavior, keeping a log of each interaction and collecting the violation notices. He knew that her actions were unreasonable, and he suspected that she was selectively enforcing the rules, targeting him specifically. He needed to find a way to stop her, to reclaim his peace of mind and his enjoyment of his new home. He just wasn't sure how yet. The neighbors noticed the change in David. His easygoing nature was slowly being replaced by a guardedness. They saw Karen's constant presence and shook their heads, whispering amongst themselves. They knew she was driving him crazy. They just didn't know what to do about it. The daily routine was relentless. Every morning, before David even had his first cup of coffee, Karen would be there, waiting. Sometimes she'd simply leave a violation notice on his doorstep. Other times, she'd confront him directly, her voice rising with each new complaint. "Mr. Miller," she'd say, pointing a finger at his slightly askew garden gnome, Section 11. For B clearly states that garden gnomes must be positioned symmetrically. This is a blatant disregard for the HOA guidelines. You have 24 hours to correct this infraction, or I will be forced to issue a fine. David's frustration grew with each passing day. He tried appealing to her sense of reason, explaining that he was doing his best to comply with the rules, but that some of them seemed arbitrary and unnecessary. He even suggested that they work together to find a compromise that would satisfy both of them. "Karen," he said one day, trying a more personal approach, "why is this so important to you? Why do you care so much about these little details?" But Karen remained unmoved. "It's not about me, Mr. Miller," she replied, her voice cold and unwavering. "It's about upholding the standards of Harmony Glades. It's about preserving property values and maintaining order. If I let you get away with these violations, others will follow, and soon our community will be ruined." Her demands became increasingly unreasonable. She insisted that he prune his hedges into perfect squares, Section 7. 3A requires all hedges to be geometrically shaped, that he replace his perfectly functional doorknob with an approved model, Section 5. 2C lists acceptable doorknob styles, yours is not among them, and even that he stop whistling while he worked in his yard, Section 10. 2A prohibits excessive noise that disturbs the peace of the neighborhood. And then came the threats. "Mr. Miller," she said one day, her eyes narrowed, "if you don't comply with these rules, I will be forced to take further action. I can have your privileges revoked, your access to the community pool denied, and even initiate legal proceedings to force you to comply." David was shocked. He couldn't believe that someone would go to such lengths over something so trivial. He knew he had to do something, but he wasn't sure what. He continued to document her behavior, recording their conversations and taking pictures of her constant surveillance. He knew that he needed evidence to prove that she was harassing him, that she was abusing her power as a member of the HOA board. He just needed to find the right opportunity to use it. He began to subtly record their interactions, using his phone's voice memo app hidden in his pocket. He also started setting up a small security camera, disguised as a birdhouse, pointed directly at his front yard. He knew this was a risk, but he felt he had no other choice. What Karen didn't know was that David, beneath his easygoing exterior, was a highly skilled attorney. He specialized in compliance law, ironically enough. He had spent years navigating complex regulations and defending clients against unfair enforcement practices. He recognized Karen's behavior for what it was, harassment and abuse of power. While he initially tried to resolve the situation amicably, he quickly realized that Karen was impervious to reason. That's when he decided to leverage his legal expertise. He knew that documenting her actions was crucial. He started by meticulously cataloging every violation notice, noting the date, time, and specific rule cited. He also began keeping a detailed journal, recording each interaction with Karen, including her exact words and demeanor. The birdhouse camera, carefully positioned to capture his front yard, provided visual evidence of Karen's constant surveillance. He made sure the camera was discreet and didn't violate any privacy laws, focusing solely on his own property. He also subtly used his phone to record their conversations. Whenever Karen approached, he'd casually slip his phone into his pocket, activating the voice memo app. He made sure to keep the phone visible, so Karen wouldn't suspect anything, but close enough to capture her voice clearly. He even started researching HOA laws and regulations, familiarizing himself with the legal framework governing Harmony Glades. He discovered several loopholes and inconsistencies in the HOA's rules, which he carefully noted. He also reached out to a few other residents, discreetly inquiring about their experiences with Karen. He learned that he wasn't the only one who had been subjected to her relentless enforcement. Some residents were hesitant to speak openly, fearing retaliation, but David assured them of his confidentiality and promised to protect their identities. As he gathered evidence, David began to formulate a plan. He knew that he couldn't confront Karen directly. She was too entrenched in her position and too convinced of her own righteousness. He needed to find a way to expose her behavior to the entire community, to show them the extent of her abuse of power. He decided to run for a position on the HOA board. He knew it was a long shot, but he believed that it was the only way to bring about real change in Harmony Glades. He also decided to quietly contact a few lawyers who specialized in HOA disputes, just to get some preliminary advice. He was building his case, piece by piece, waiting for the right moment to strike. He was no longer just a frustrated neighbor, he was a lawyer building a case. A few weeks later, a notice arrived announcing the annual Harmony Glades HOA community meeting. This year's agenda included a discussion of ongoing community issues, a review of the budget, and the election of new board members. Karen read the notice with a smug smile. She had been a board member for years, and she was confident that she would be re-elected. After all, who else was as dedicated to upholding the standards of Harmony Glades as she was? She saw the meeting as an opportunity to solidify her position and to further crack down on any perceived violations. She spent the days leading up to the meeting preparing a detailed presentation outlining her accomplishments and her plans for the future. She even included a section on the importance of enforcing the HOA rules, complete with charts and graphs illustrating the positive impact of her strict enforcement policies. She was completely oblivious to the quiet revolution brewing beneath the surface. She had no idea that David was planning to challenge her authority, or that many of the other residents were secretly hoping for a change. She was so consumed by her own self-importance that she failed to notice the subtle shifts in the neighborhood's atmosphere. David, on the other hand, saw the community meeting as the perfect opportunity to expose Karen's behavior and to rally support for his own candidacy. He spent the days leading up to the meeting talking to his neighbors, sharing his experiences with Karen, and outlining his vision for a more harmonious and inclusive community. He emphasized the importance of fairness, transparency, and common sense in enforcing the HOA rules. He didn't reveal his legal background or his plan to challenge Karen directly. He simply presented himself as a concerned neighbor who wanted to make Harmony Glades a better place to live. He was careful not to badmouth Karen, focusing instead on the need for positive change and a more collaborative approach to community governance. He also made sure to bring his evidence to the meeting. He had compiled all the violation notices, journal entries, recordings, and photos into a comprehensive presentation that he was prepared to share if necessary. He hoped that he wouldn't have to resort to exposing Karen publicly, but he was ready to do whatever it took to bring about change in Harmony Glades. He knew that the meeting would be a pivotal moment, a showdown between the old guard and the new. He just hoped that he was prepared for whatever might happen. The other residents, sensing the impending conflict, felt a mixture of excitement and apprehension. They knew that the meeting would be anything but ordinary. The Harmony Glades community meeting was held in the neighborhood clubhouse, a bland, beige building that perfectly embodied the HOA's aesthetic. The room was packed, more crowded than it had been in years. A palpable tension hung in the air, a sense of anticipation and unease. The residents knew something significant was about to happen. Karen, dressed in a perfectly tailored suit, sat at the head of the table, radiating confidence and authority. She surveyed the room with a self-satisfied smirk, completely unaware of the storm clouds gathering around her. She had brought multiple copies of her meticulously prepared presentation and a stack of violation notices, ready to address any perceived infractions. She dominated the early part of the meeting, rattling off statistics about property values, landscaping regulations, and parking enforcement. She spoke with unwavering conviction, her voice echoing through the room. She answered questions with a condescending tone, often interrupting residents and correcting their grammar. David, in stark contrast, sat quietly in the back of the room, observing the proceedings. He wore a simple button-down shirt and jeans, blending in with the other residents. He listened attentively, taking mental notes and carefully assessing the mood of the crowd. He remained calm and composed, projecting an air of quiet confidence. He knew that his moment would come. The other residents noticed the contrast between Karen's overbearing presence and David's quiet demeanor. They saw the way Karen dismissed their concerns and the way David listened with genuine interest. They whispered amongst themselves, exchanging knowing glances. They sensed that David was different, that he represented a new hope for Harmony Glades. As the meeting dragged on, Karen's dominance began to wane. Residents started to push back, questioning her strict enforcement policies and challenging her authority. They spoke of the need for more flexibility, more understanding, and more community spirit. The atmosphere in the room began to shift, the tension thickening as the residents found their voice. David remained silent, waiting for the opportune moment to make his move. He knew that the tide was turning, that Karen's reign of beige terror was about to come to an end. He just needed to choose the right moment to strike. The air crackled with anticipation. Everyone knew that the election of new board members would be the deciding factor. Finally, the time came for the election of new board members. Karen confidently nominated herself, listing her qualifications and experience. A few residents politely clapped. Then, a voice spoke from the back of the room. "I'd like to nominate David Miller," a woman said, her voice clear and strong. Several other residents immediately seconded the nomination. Karen's smile faltered, a flicker of unease crossing her face. She hadn't anticipated this. David stood up, his expression calm and composed. "Thank you," he said, addressing the room. "I appreciate the nomination. Before we proceed, there's something I feel the community should be aware of." He paused, taking a deep breath. This was it. "Many of you know that I've recently moved into Harmony Glades," he continued. "And since then, I've had some interesting interactions with one of our current board members." He glanced at Karen, who was now staring at him with a mixture of confusion and suspicion. "I've been subjected to a campaign of harassment," David stated, his voice firm and resolute. "Constant surveillance, unreasonable demands, and even threats. And I believe it's important for everyone to understand the extent of this behavior before we vote on new board members." He then calmly proceeded to present his evidence. He started with the violation notices, displaying them on a projector for everyone to see. He pointed out the absurdity of some of the rules and the selective enforcement that Karen had employed. Next, he played audio recordings of his conversations with Karen. The room fell silent as Karen's voice filled the air, berating David for his garden gnome placement, his welcome mat, and his whistling. Her tone was harsh and condescending, her words filled with disdain. Then, he showed photos taken from his birdhouse camera, documenting Karen's constant surveillance of his property. The images clearly showed her standing across the street, binoculars in hand, meticulously observing his every move. Finally, he presented statements from other residents, who corroborated his story and shared their own experiences with Karen's overbearing enforcement. The statements were anonymous, to protect them from retaliation, but they painted a clear picture of Karen's abuse of power. The room was stunned into silence. Karen sat frozen at the head of the table, her face pale and her mouth agape. She couldn't believe what was happening. She had been so confident, so sure of her position, and now everything was crumbling around her. The residents of Harmony Glades finally saw Karen for what she truly was, a bully hiding behind a rulebook. The silence was broken by a murmur that grew steadily louder, a collective expression of shock, anger, and finally, a sense of liberation. Karen, finally snapping out of her stunned silence, attempted to defend herself, but her efforts were feeble and unconvincing in the face of the overwhelming evidence. "This is all a misunderstanding," she stammered, her voice trembling. "I was simply trying to uphold the standards of our community. I was just doing my job." She tried to argue that the rules were in place for a reason, that she was only enforcing them fairly and consistently. But her words rang hollow, contradicted by the audio recordings and the witness statements. She claimed that David was exaggerating, that he was twisting her words and taking her actions out of context. But the evidence spoke for itself. She tried to discredit David, questioning his motives and suggesting that he was trying to undermine the HOA. "He's new to the neighborhood," she exclaimed. "He doesn't understand how things work here. He's trying to disrupt our community." But the residents weren't buying it. They had seen Karen's behavior firsthand, and they knew that David was telling the truth. They had been subjected to her overbearing enforcement for years, and they were finally ready to stand up to her. One resident stood up and spoke, his voice filled with anger. "We're not stupid, Karen," he said. "We've all been on the receiving end of your ridiculous rules and your constant harassment. You've made our lives miserable for years, and we're tired of it." Another resident added, "You've turned Harmony Glades into a place where people are afraid to express themselves, afraid to be different. You've sucked all the joy out of our community." Karen's attempts to defend herself grew increasingly desperate. She started to cry, claiming that she was being unfairly targeted, that she was the victim of a personal vendetta. But her tears were crocodile tears, and no one was fooled. She had no real defense, no way to explain away the evidence that David had presented. Her reign of terror was over. The rulebook she had wielded like a weapon had finally turned against her. She was exposed, humiliated, and utterly defeated. The residents of Harmony Glades had finally found their voice, and they were ready to take back their community. The tide had turned completely, and Karen knew it. Her carefully constructed world was crumbling around her. The vote was swift and decisive. A motion was made to remove Karen from the board immediately, citing her abuse of power and her violation of the HOA's code of conduct. The motion was seconded enthusiastically. A show of hands was called for. Almost every hand in the room shot up, a sea of raised arms signaling the end of Karen's reign. Only Karen's hand remained stubbornly at her side, trembling slightly. The vote count was overwhelming, 97 in favor, 1 opposed. A collective cheer erupted from the residents, a release of pent-up frustration and a celebration of their newfound freedom. They clapped, they cheered, they hugged each other, their faces beaming with joy. The atmosphere in the room transformed from one of tension and unease to one of hope and optimism. Karen sat slumped in her chair, her face buried in her hands, her body shaking with sobs. She couldn't believe what had happened. She had dedicated her life to Harmony Glades, and now she was being cast out like a pariah. She had lost everything. Then came the vote for the new board members. David was elected in a landslide victory, receiving almost every vote. He stood up and addressed the room, his voice filled with gratitude and determination. "Thank you," he said, his eyes scanning the crowd. "Thank you for your trust and your support. I promise to do my best to represent your interests and to make Harmony Glades a better place for all of us." He outlined his vision for a more harmonious and inclusive community, emphasizing the importance of fairness, transparency, and common sense in enforcing the HOA rules. He promised to review the existing rules, to eliminate any that were unnecessary or unreasonable, and to create a more collaborative approach to community governance. The residents listened intently, their faces filled with hope. They believed that David was the leader they had been waiting for, someone who would finally bring peace and prosperity to Harmony Glades. As the meeting adjourned, the residents filed out of the clubhouse, their spirits lifted and their hearts filled with hope. They knew that the road ahead wouldn't be easy, but they were confident that, with David's leadership, they could create a better future for their community. The air of Harmony Glades felt different, lighter. The reign of beige was officially over. A new dawn was breaking. Karen, utterly defeated, hurried out of the clubhouse, her face still buried in her hands. She stumbled back to her perfectly manicured house, the place that had once been her sanctuary now feeling like a prison. She locked the door behind her, collapsing onto the sofa in a flood of tears. She couldn't understand what had gone wrong. She had only been trying to do what was right, to uphold the standards of Harmony Glades. Why couldn't anyone see that? Why did they all hate her so much? She replayed the events of the meeting in her head, each moment a fresh wave of humiliation. She saw the shocked faces of the residents, heard their angry voices, and felt the sting of their rejection. She had lost everything, her position, her power, and her sense of purpose. A gentle knock on the door startled her. She hesitated for a moment, then reluctantly opened it. David stood on her doorstep, his expression kind and compassionate. He held out a small plate of homemade cookies. "Karen," he said softly, "I know this is a difficult time for you. I just wanted to check in and see if you were okay." Karen stared at him, her eyes filled with suspicion. "Why are you doing this?" she asked, her voice choked with emotion. "Why are you being so nice to me after what I did to you?" David smiled gently. "Because I don't hate you, Karen," he replied. "I just think you were misguided. You were so focused on enforcing the rules that you forgot about the people behind them." He paused, then added, "Look, I know you care about Harmony Glades. You just need to find a better way to show it. And if you want, I'm happy to help you understand the HOA rules properly. I can explain the legal nuances and the intent behind them. Maybe together, we can find a way to make them work for everyone." Karen stared at him in disbelief. She couldn't understand why he was being so generous, so forgiving. After all she had done to him, he was offering her his help. Slowly, hesitantly, she reached out and took the plate of cookies. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "That's very kind of you." David smiled. "Anytime, Karen," he said. "And if you ever need anything, don't hesitate to ask." He turned to leave, then paused. "Oh, and by the way," he added with a wink, "I'm thinking of painting my mailbox a nice shade of beige. What do you think?" Karen managed a weak smile. Maybe, just maybe, there was hope for her after all. Maybe she could learn to be a better neighbor, a better member of the community. Maybe she could even find a way to make amends for her past mistakes. It would take time, but with David's help, she might just be able to turn her life around. The first step was admitting she needed help. A wave of relief washed over Harmony Glades. The residents felt like they could finally breathe again, like a weight had been lifted from their shoulders. The atmosphere in the neighborhood transformed almost overnight. People started smiling more, chatting with their neighbors, and taking pride in their homes. David, true to his word, set about creating a more positive HOA environment. He reviewed the existing rules, eliminating those that were unnecessary or unreasonable and clarifying those that were ambiguous. He established a more transparent and collaborative approach to community governance, encouraging residents to participate in decision-making and to voice their concerns. He organized community events, like neighborhood barbecues and gardening workshops, to foster a sense of camaraderie and connection. He even started a community garden, where residents could come together to grow fruits, vegetables, and flowers. Karen, humbled by her experience, slowly began to emerge from her self-imposed isolation. She started attending community events, offering her help with various tasks. She even volunteered to help David with the community garden, using her knowledge of landscaping to create a beautiful and productive space. She listened carefully to David's explanations of the HOA rules, finally understanding the intent behind them. She realized that she had been so focused on the letter of the law that she had forgotten about the spirit of the law, the importance of fairness, and the needs of the community. She apologized to David for her behavior, expressing her remorse and her willingness to make amends. David, in turn, forgave her completely, assuring her that everyone makes mistakes and that what matters is how we learn from them. The other residents, seeing Karen's genuine remorse and her efforts to change, slowly began to accept her back into the community. They realized that she was not a bad person, just a misguided one. Harmony Glades became a truly harmonious place, a community where people cared about each other, where rules were enforced fairly and respectfully, and where everyone felt a sense of belonging. David's leadership and Karen's transformation had created a community that was stronger, more resilient, and more vibrant than ever before. The era of beige was long gone, replaced by a rainbow of colors and a symphony of laughter. The HOA was no longer a source of fear and resentment, but a force for good, working to create a better future for all. And it all started with a new neighbor, a plate of cookies, and a willingness to forgive. The residents of Harmony Glades learned that even the most rigid rules could bend with a little kindness and understanding. Karen, seeking a new purpose in life, needed something to fill the void left by the HOA. At first, she was lost, unsure of what to do with her time. She wandered around her house, aimlessly dusting and rearranging furniture. She felt adrift, like a ship without a rudder. David, sensing her struggle, gently encouraged her to find a new hobby, something that would bring her joy and connect her with the community in a positive way. He suggested a few options, but nothing seemed to spark her interest. Then, one day, while helping David in the community garden, she noticed a small, brightly colored bird flitting among the flowers. She was captivated by its beauty and its graceful movements. She asked David about it, and he explained that it was a hummingbird, a common visitor to the garden. Intrigued, Karen started researching birds, learning about their different species, their habitats, and their behaviors. She discovered a whole new world of wonder and fascination. She bought a pair of binoculars and a bird identification guide, and she started spending hours in her backyard, observing the birds that visited her feeder. She became an avid birdwatcher, meticulously documenting her sightings and sharing her knowledge with others. She even joined a local birdwatching club, where she met other enthusiasts who shared her passion. At first, she approached birdwatching with her characteristic meticulousness, following all the rules and regulations of the hobby. She learned the proper techniques for identifying birds, the correct etiquette for birdwatching, and the best practices for protecting bird habitats. But over time, she began to relax and to enjoy the simple pleasure of observing nature. She learned to appreciate the beauty of the birds, their songs, and their unique personalities. She discovered that birdwatching was not just about following rules, but about connecting with the natural world and finding joy in the simple things. She even started using her knowledge of landscaping to create a bird-friendly habitat in her backyard, planting native trees and shrubs that provided food and shelter for the birds. She made sure to follow all the HOA guidelines, of course, but she did so in a helpful and creative way, enhancing the beauty of her property and attracting a variety of birds to her yard. Karen's transformation was complete. She had gone from being a feared and resented enforcer of HOA rules to a beloved and respected member of the community, a knowledgeable birdwatcher, and a dedicated steward of the environment. She had finally found her true calling, a way to use her passion for order and her attention to detail to make the world a better place. And it all started with a hummingbird in a community garden. Karen learned that true harmony comes not from rigid rules, but from a love of nature, a sense of community, and a willingness to change. The end.